Van Nuys helicopter 2 Echo X-ray with you for the special VFR transition. We are currently at 1400.
Helicopter 10 to Echo X-ray Van Nuys Tower. Wind calm, visibility 2.5, speed 1,100 overcast, Van Nuys altimeter 3016. Cleared into Van Nuys class Delta, northeast of Van Nuys along the 118 freeway. Westbound, advise when you're in VFR conditions or when you're clear of Van Nuys class Delta. Transition outer blow 2,500. Ready.
2 Echo X-ray advised in VFR condition, and then we'll stay on the 118, so we're currently at 1400, and we have 0235.
Helicopter 2 Echo X-ray, thank you. And once you're clear Van Nuys Delta, did you want to talk to SoCal?
Affirmative, 2 Echo.
2 Echo X-ray, you're still too low level for flight following at this time.
Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. You've just heard audio from the Van Nuys Tower and later from SoCal Approach as they were communicating with a helicopter that crashed this weekend, killing basketball star Kobe Bryant and 8 others. And we'll talk about that and 2 other high-profile crashes that occurred in the last few days during my updates. For our main topic today, we'll be talking about what it's been like flying the Vision Jet for about 75 hours over the last 4 to 5 weeks. So yes, I've been a little busy. So by the way, if you're thinking of buying a new or used Cirrus SR20, SR22, or Vision Jet, call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 135, we talked with Brian Deere about what it takes to fly a GA aircraft to Mexico. So if you missed that, you may want to check it out. And just a quick favor, if you haven't done so already, please click the subscribe button on your phone. And not only will that alert you when new episodes of the show are available each week, but it will also boost our rankings, making it more likely that other people will find the show. This week in the news, we have more news on ADS-B in both the U.S. and Mexican airspace. Toyota gets into aviation in a big way. And finally, we have a pilot with a dog ate my homework excuse for his airplane accident. All this and more, and the news starts now. From flyingmag.com, the FAA releases a new AC regarding ADS-B ops. The FAA released its advisory circular AC 90-114B, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast Operations, to provide guidance for pilots flying under Part 91. Most notably, the AC emphasizes that ADS-B is not a replacement for looking out the window. The mandate, while promoting higher visibility on traffic in your vicinity while flying, is not an excuse to quit your scan for traffic and could be a distraction. If you plan to operate within Class A, your aircraft will need to have 1090 ES installed and operational. If you're outside of Class A, then you fall under 91.225 and can utilize either 1090 ES or the Universal Access Transmitter UAT ADS-B that operates on 978 MHz. The AC also covers special missions such as formation flights and exceptions to the rule for aircraft built without electrical systems. The means of compliance in both instances are similar to those that would normally require a transponder. From AIN Online, Mexico delays its ADS-B mandate until 2022. ADS-B out requirements for Mexican airspace were delayed until January 1, 2022, according to a circular issued by the Mexican Civil Aviation Authority. Originally, the mandate was scheduled to go into effect this past January 1. According to the circular, when the requirements do take effect, they will apply to operations in Mexico Class A, B, C, E airspace and Class E airspace above 10,000 feet. It is required now in Class E airspace over the Gulf of Mexico at and above 3,000 feet MSL within 12 nautical miles of the Mexican coast. The Mexican CAA gave no official reasons for the delay, but several other countries have recently delayed their ADS-B compliance dates because required equipment either is not readily available or not installed in enough aircraft. Government and ATC infrastructure for supporting ADS-B operations is not fully in place to meet the original deadline, and or they are responding to stakeholder requests for a delay. Last November, NAV Canada announced it was delaying its 2021 mandatory compliance with ADS-B in response to feedback from stakeholders. The company, which operates Canada's ATC system, noted that ADS-B will be used for surveillance in Class A airspace starting in February 2021, but there will be no mandate for equipage at that time. From AOPA.org, survey seeks pilot input on FAA test. AOPA is encouraging pilots to take a survey by January 30th that will be used to help update the content of private pilot, instrument rating, commercial pilot, an ATP knowledge and practical test. The online survey, which is confidential and should take about 25 minutes to complete, is part of a review the FAA asked its testing contractor, PSI, to conduct to ensure the exams reflect current practices. Quote, "This is a very relevant and important way for the pilot community to give feedback on whether the material being tested is applicable and relevant," said Christopher Cooper, AOPA Director of Regulatory Affairs. And we will, of course, include a link to that survey in our show notes. And from flyer.co.uk and a number of sources, Garmin launches electronic steam instruments. For a lot of older aircraft, while a conversion to a full glass cockpit sounds appealing, it's a huge job and expensive. You've also got to learn how to use it. How about a straight swap of all those ancient round mechanical gauges for modern electronic instruments? Garmin has just announced the GI-275 electronic flight instrument that directly replaces legacy primary flight instruments in the cockpit. The GI-275 is suitable as a direct replacement for a variety of instruments including attitude indicator, attitude directional indicator, course deviation indicator, HSI or horizontal situation indicator, engine indication system, and it's capable of serving as a 4-in-1 flight instrument. The GI-275 can also be installed as a standby to a number of glass flight displays and is available with a 60-minute backup battery. It fits exactly into the common 3 1/8-inch flight instrument size, reducing installation time and preserving the existing aircraft panel. The GI-275 is also compatible with a variety of third-party autopilots and does not require a separate interface adapter, further reducing installation cost. It's received FAA approval and is available immediately for installation in more than 1,000 different single-engine and multi-engine aircraft models. It's also capable of displaying multifunction display-like features such as traffic, weather, safe taxi airport diagrams, and synthetic vision technology. From dailytimes.com, which is the Kerrville Daily Times in Texas, Mooney furloughs employees again and walks back the holiday pay. Employees at Mooney Aircraft were told to go home, and the company couldn't pay them for 2 weeks of holiday pay they were previously promised. Financially troubled aircraft manufacturer recalled its employees before Christmas, told them they would receive 2 weeks of holiday pay and to return to work, according to Devin Burns, who's worked for more than 2 years as the company's human resources specialist and de facto public information officer. Burns said 55 employees were sent home. Quote, "There have been a lot of promises," Burns said of this latest closure. "I've just been trying to help keep Mooney stay alive." Burns said employees were promised before Christmas they would receive 2 weeks of pay, but said company management told her the company couldn't afford to make those payments. "It's extremely frustrating," she said. While Burns remains steadfastly supportive of the work done at Mooney and her fellow employees, she said she's looking for work in the Kerrville area to support herself and 2 children. It's been a whirlwind for the employees who were furloughed for 10 days in November before being recalled to work toward the end of the month. And I have read in a follow-on article that unfortunately she too has been let go, so apparently there's now no longer anyone on staff at Mooney. The company has been owned by a Chinese-based company, Meijing Group, which infused money into the troubled airplane manufacturer in 2013. Mooney has built and delivered 41 single-engine aircraft since the Chinese company took over 7 years ago. Burns said she was told that the company is continuing to look for investors, but she wasn't sure what the future held for a company that's gone through 11 ownership changes and 3 bankruptcies since moving to Kerrville in the 1950s. From flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer Magazine, Toyota invests millions in Joby eVTOL. Now, I don't usually talk about eVTOL stories on this podcast because there are probably at least 100 different companies which are making eVTOLs, but this story is significantly different because of the dollar amount. The world's biggest car manufacturer, Toyota, has invested $394 million in Joby Aviation's electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL air taxi, making it the lead investor in the project. Now, that is a huge amount of money for an eVTOL company. Quote, "Air transportation has been a long-term goal for Toyota, and while we continue our work in the automotive business, this agreement sets our sights to the sky," said Toyota Motor Corporation President and CEO Akio Toyoda. "As we take up the challenge of air transportation together with Joby, an innovation in emerging eVTOL space, we tap the potential to revolutionize future transportation and life. Through this new and exciting endeavor, we hope to deliver freedom of movement and enjoyment to customers everywhere on land and now in the sky." As the lead investor in Joby's $590 million latest round of financing, Toyota will share its expertise in manufacturing, quality and cost controls for the development and production of Joby Aviation's eVTOL aircraft. California-based Joby Aviation's aircraft is a piloted 5-seat vehicle capable of both vertical takeoff and landing and highly efficient wing-borne forward flight. It's capable of speeds of 200 miles per hour and can fly for over 150 miles on a single charge. The aircraft is 100 times quieter than conventional aircraft during takeoff and landing and near silent when flying overhead. The passenger experience is optimized for comfortable ride-sharing operations and efficient entry and exit. Joby's target is to enter into service in 2023 and is working with the FAA on airworthiness regulations and with taxi company Uber. Now, one of their main locations is fairly close to me here in Northern California, in Santa Cruz, California. And I went on their website at jobyaviation.com and counted 140 jobs that are currently listed. So if you're interested in an aviation job in Northern California, you may want to check out jobyaviation.com. From generalaviationnews.com, a new initiative launches to offer long-term aircraft rentals to student pilots. A new initiative, Time Build USA, has launched at the Palatka Municipal Airport in Florida. The idea is to give student pilots access to longer-term rentals than by the hour. Student pilots can rent the company's Cessna 150s for days or even weeks at a time. According to Carrie Green, program manager at Time Build USA, the global pilot shortage and increased demand for training means there's a limited supply of planes to rent. Quote, by giving our clients exclusive use of an aircraft, pilots get a chance to build meaningful time, he says. Getting out of your own backyard and managing real-world challenges provides a richer, more robust experience than traditional one-day out-and-back cross-countries, plus it's a lot more fun and rewarding. He explains that Time Build USA's model dispenses with traditional daily minimums and instead requires a weekly minimum of 20 hours. This allows our clients the ability to design their own itinerary and schedule, he explains. Rental rate is $75 per hour dry. The company received its first airplane in November 2019 to prepare for the December launch. We plan to add 2 additional aircraft in the first quarter of 2020, he says. Aircraft will be added thereafter as demand for the service grows. Because those seeking to build hours are generally lower-time pilots, helping them develop sound judgment and risk assessment skills is a top priority for the new company, according to Green. Student pilots aren't the only market for the new service. Time Build USA's aircraft rental service is also well-suited to recreational pilots seeking longer-term rentals for personal enjoyment, he says. Domestic or international pilots wanting to create an unforgettable flying vacation now have the means to do so. While Time Build USA is now only based in Northeast Florida, company officials hope to expand to additional locations in weather-favorable states, including Texas and Arizona. From generalaviationnews.com, ForeFlight founder and an astronaut are among Texas Aviation Hall of Fame class of 2020. The Lone Star Flight Museum has revealed their class of 2020 for introduction into the Texas Aviation Hall of Fame. NASA's George W.S. Abbey, who is a retired colonel, astronaut Eileen Collins, who grew up in Elmira, New York, very close to my hometown, and airline entrepreneur Usto Schultz and ForeFlight CEO Tyson Weiss have been selected from a field of more than 100 candidates. The 4 will be inducted into the Hall of Fame May 8th at the Lone Star Flight Museum at Houston's Ellington Airport. Now, Tyson Weiss, who is a Patreon supporter of this show, was born in South Carolina. He received a BS from Trinity University in computer science and an MBA from Rice University. He's the CEO of ForeFlight, a Texas-based software company that employs over 200 people in Houston and Austin. Weiss's software has revolutionized flight planning, in-flight weather, and was the first to bring the concept of an electronic flight bag to the iPad. ForeFlight is also the provider of Jeppesen Flight Deck Pro EFB used by airline pilots around the world. The Texas Aviation Hall of Fame was established in 1995 to recognize Texans and Texas companies or organizations that have made significant and lasting contributions to the advancement of aviation. Also from generalaviationnews.com, the FAA releases a NOTAM for the Super Bowl. General aviation pilots who plan to fly to Miami for the Super Bowl, as well as pilots who want to fly around Miami or Fort Lauderdale between January 27th and February 4th, need to check out the FAA's NOTAM for air traffic procedures for the area. Super Bowl 54 will be on Sunday, February 2nd at Hard Rock Stadium. Game time will be at approximately 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The FAA has published a webpage with information for South Florida area airspace and airports. The agency will update the webpage as additional information becomes available. As a designated national security special event, additional unmanned aircraft restrictions will be in place before, during, and after the Super Bowl. In other words, don't try and fly your drone around the Super Bowl. A reservation program to facilitate ground services at a number of South Florida airports will be in effect from January 27th through February 4th. Pilots should contact the FBO at their airport to obtain reservations and additional information. Quote, we expect the TFR will be active from 4 p.m. to midnight on Sunday, February 2nd, FAA officials said. The TFR will have a 10 nautical mile inner core and a 30 nautical mile outer ring. The TFR will not affect regularly scheduled commercial flights flying in and out of Miami or Fort Lauderdale international airports. From planeandpilot.com, an interesting story about a Mooney. When Dennis Pruitt and his wife Karen departed from Coolidge, Arizona on their way to Henderson, Nevada, they didn't make it very far before something happened that's happened to many of us. Here's how Dennis described the drama. He said, my wife and I left Coolidge to Henderson a couple of weeks ago in our Mooney. After we took off, the passenger door open. My wife latched onto me like she was going to get sucked out of the airplane like an airline disaster movie. After I reassured her, we turned back to the airport. She always wraps herself in a blanket while we fly anywhere, and her blanket had gotten sucked halfway out the door, but she was able to retrieve it. We landed, locked the door, and an hour and 49 minutes later, we were in Henderson, Nevada. When we arrived, she couldn't find her phone. My wife and I share our locations, and I saw on my phone that the last location of her phone was 3 miles from the airport we took off from. We came back 3 days later to look around for it. The airport manager even loaned us an ATV to go out into the desert to hunt for the phone. Amazingly, we found it, undamaged and in perfect shape. The phone was dropped from 1,000 feet AGL at 125 miles an hour. Great story, and I've seen some videos on the internet in the past where people who were filming either with cameras or with a smartphone dropped it as they were filming. It's rather remarkable to see the video as the phone or the camera goes on down to Earth. And finally, here's our dog ate my homework story. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot blames accident on his dog. The pilot reported that before local flight, he placed the airplane's wing and canopy covers and his small dog in the baggage compartment of the Lancer Legacy. During the initial climb after retracting the landing gear, the cockpit canopy, which tips forward for entry into the cockpit, came unlatched and opened to about a 45-degree angle. He attempted to close and relatch the canopy to no avail and decided to return to the departure airport in Friday Harbor, Washington. After extending the landing gear on final, the airplane lost speed and the descent rate increased. He applied full power, but the airplane landed hard and short of the runway, and the landing gear collapsed. The pilot reported that the airplane had an aftermarket drop-down step kit that had been removed. However, while the step mechanism had been removed, the brackets that extend into the baggage compartment had been overlooked. The brackets were attached to the canopy latching mechanism, and he believed his dog accidentally hit the protruding brackets and inadvertently opened the canopy in flight. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the center wing spar. The pilot reported that before the canopy opened, there were no pre-accident mechanical failures or malfunctions with the airplane that would have precluded normal operation. Probable cause? The pilot's inability to maintain the landing flare, which resulted in the airplane landing hard short of the runway. Contributing to the accident was the cockpit canopy opening in flight. And by the way, here's a comment which is from the instructions of a Lancer operating handbook. It says, unlatched canopy in flight. The canopy must not be open in flight. Doing so may cause it to separate from the aircraft, possibly injuring the occupants in the process. Should a latch become disengaged from the lock position, slow the aircraft to approximately 85 knots and attempt to relock. If unable to lock, land as soon as practical. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll get to our main topic, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. In a moment, I'll get to my update on 75 hours of Vision Jet flying that I've done in the past month. But first, here's a fun flying destination, which happens to be one of my favorite places to fly here in California.
Hi, Max. Jim from Northern California here. Great work on the podcast. I listen every weekend on my way to and from the hangar, and I don't think I've missed an episode. This is for your list of favorite airports to visit. Mine is Shelter Cove, 0 Quebec 5 on the Lost Coast of California. It's about an hour flight from my home airport in the SF Bay area, and it's right on the coast between San Francisco and the Oregon border. And it's so off the beaten path, it'd probably take you 5 or 6 hours to drive there if you did that in no traffic. Two great things about it. One is the runway lies on a small peninsula that juts out into the ocean, and landing there feels like you're landing on an aircraft carrier. It's a beautiful coastal vista that you're flying over when you make the arrival and the approach. The second is that the airport backs right up against what I think is the most beautiful beach in all of California. It's a stunning black sand beach that goes for miles and miles and miles. And if you walk that beach, it's very likely you'll have it to yourself. There just aren't that many people up there. beach is part of a 25-mile Lost Coast Trail that's in the King Range National Conservation Area. The airport doesn't have any weather reporting, but there are some online webcams you can check out to get an idea of what you're getting into before you launch. Fog and low stratus are typically what we deal with. Last time I was there, the airport campground restaurant had pretty good fish and chips. And there you have it. That's my favorite place to fly, Shelter Cove. Thanks for everything you're doing for GA, Max. Much appreciated.
And Jim also sent along a link to a video that's available on YouTube where you can watch him landing at Shelter Cove. It's really spectacular, and I'll include that in the show notes. Hey, and if you're an aircraft owner or thinking about becoming one, you're going to be interested in recent changes in the aircraft insurance marketplace. Namely, rates are going up a lot. Tom Haynes of AOPA wrote a recent article about why rates are going up, and I'll include a link to that article in the show notes. Also, Tom is the guest on this week's episode of the Airplane Geeks podcast, so you might want to check out our interview of him on that show, for which I'm also a co-host. Now, there have been a number of high-profile accidents here in the last few days, and I want to first thank Roland Delholm. He sent me a link to this story via Facebook Messenger. This comes from Colson Aviation, a press release from January 22nd, and they say, while working in the snowy Monaro area in southern NSW, which would be New South Wales, Australia, contact was lost with one of our large air tankers, a Lockheed C-130, registration November 134 Charlie Golf. The aircraft had departed Richmond, NSW, with a load of retardant and was on a firebombing mission. The accident is reported to be extensive, and we're deeply saddened to confirm there were 3 fatalities. The accident response team has been activated, as well as local emergency services. Colson Aviation will be sending a team to the site to assist in emergency operations. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the 3 crew members on board. Sincerely, the Colson family. So those were 3 Americans who were killed on that C-130, which was fighting the massive wildfires that have been active in many parts of Australia. Also, a few days ago, a U.S. pilot and 2 spectators were killed during a practice flight on Friday, the 24th of January in Guatemala. Steve Andelin was piloting a Zivco Edge 540T as part of Kirby Chandler's Red Bull-sponsored airshow act, according to local media. At least 2 spectators also died when the aircraft crashed in the showground area, and another was seriously injured. The aircraft wreckage came to rest in a nearby river. Statement on the Team Chambliss Facebook page the day after the crash said it's with great sadness that Team Chambliss confirms that our friend and pilot Steve Andelin, along with 2 spectators, lost their lives at a private air show. Steve Andelin was flying a plane which carried Red Bull branding owned by Kirby Chambliss. We're deeply shocked and extend our deepest sympathies to the families involved in this tragic accident. They said that Mr. Andelin was a test pilot for Zivco Aeronautics and an airline pilot. He'd spent 2 years on the U.S. aerobatics team. And I have seen some video from this crash, and I know very little, frankly, about aerobatics, but it looked like they were doing a barrel roll while descending. It appeared that the aircraft had recovered and was in a straight and level attitude, but still had a high descent rate when it impacted the ground just feet away from where the video was being shot. So a very tragic accident. And of course, just on this past Sunday, the FAA confirmed that NBA basketball star Kobe Bryant was among 9 people who died in the crash of a Sikorsky S-76B helicopter. This comes from Plane and Pilot magazine. And what they say is that just before 10 a.m. on Sunday in the San Fernando Valley city of Calabasas, that the aircraft crashed, killing Bryant, his 13-year-old daughter, and 7 other people. Weather conditions were poor with widespread fog in the area. In fact, LA police helicopters were grounded at the time due to low weather conditions, and the Bryant helicopter was operating under a special VFR clearance. Such a clearance is given aircraft that are not operating under IFR rules and typically require the pilot to follow ground references. In the case of the accident helicopter, those ground references were freeways. Reports of mechanical issues plaguing the flight are unfounded. Air traffic control logs show the helicopter held for 15 minutes because of conflicting IFR traffic at Burbank, and then transited that airspace and then Van Nuys traffic area before proceeding westbound. The pilot requested flight following, but SoCal Approach was unable to provide the service as the helicopter was too low for radar coverage in the area it was flying, according to ATC tapes. The flight then proceeded for reasons unknown in a southerly direction toward terrain that was far higher than the helicopter's altitude, and when controllers attempted to contact the pilot, no response was heard and the aircraft disappeared from radar. Although the causes for the crash are still unknown, the NTSB is investigating. Radar reports show the helicopter just before it collided with terrain descending at an extremely high rate, around 4,000 feet per minute, at 160 knots at the time of the crash. The debris field, according to video of the crash site, was extensive. Then crash started a brush fire in the hills, which LA firefighters were able to extinguish. So we, of course, extend our deepest condolences to all the families who were involved in all of these crashes. Now let's change gears and talk about some articles that I've read here over the past couple of weeks. First one comes from the Airfax Journal called A Lesson for Life. And this is a story about a gentleman who was landing and it didn't go all that well at the last moment. The flight instructor had to save the landing. And he writes, "On final approach, I was still too high and compensated with full flaps and a slip. I convinced myself that the approach still looked okay, but even to my untrained eye, it was obvious that this was not one of my best approaches, familiar airfield or not. Ultimately, the flight instructor had to take over, and afterwards he offered some critique." And these are some of the things that he said. He said, "There was not a single mistake. You were at least 1,500 feet too high when you identified the airfield. You were close, and you were aware of that. You misinterpreted the radio message to land at your own discretion as an order to land. You wanted to impress by completing what you started instead of minimizing risk. You ignored that fighting for your descent resulted in being too late on every step in the approach mentally and physically. You ignored all the accumulating warning signs on final and were overloaded with tasks. You ignored the option to go around, an option you had all the time until milliseconds before touchdown. But actually, you should have opted to enter the traffic pattern in the first place instead of trying to prove how cool you were with a straight-in approach." Wow. Rather interesting article. I have a link to that in the show notes if you want to see the full article yourself. And here's an article from avweb.com called Downwind or Downhill. And they say pilots are taught to take off and land into the wind and avoid landing or departing with a tailwind. There is a reason the performance penalty of a tailwind is much greater than the benefit of a headwind. How big a penalty? Go to your POH and calculate it. The most common figure is to add 10% to the takeoff or landing roll for every 2 knots of tailwind up to 10 knots. So if you run those calculations, that tells you that with a 10-knot tailwind, your landing distance is going to be 50% longer, which is quite a bit. Article continues, the specific penalty will vary based on a number of factors like runway surface, density, altitude, and gross weight. Somewhere down in the fine print, you may see an additional penalty for runway slope. But often runway slope is neglected because most runways are level. Now, I think I mentioned in an earlier episode that I spent perhaps 45 minutes in flight with a pilot sometime last year in an SR20 figuring out whether it was going to be better to land at Blue Canyon Airport with a headwind on their downsloping runway or with a tailwind on the upsloping runway. Now, Blue Canyon has a 1.1% upward slope when landing to the northwest. It's just 3,300 feet long, and it has a field elevation of 5,284 feet. Now, the pilot wanted to do several things on this flight, and he hadn't told me before we departed that one of those things was he wanted to land at Blue Canyon. Had he let me know that, we would have run the calculations ahead of time. Ultimately, we determined that landing downhill with a headwind was the most optimal thing to do, and it worked out just fine. Now, more recently, I was headed into Santa Monica Airport, which is just 3,500 feet long in a Vision jet at night, and I asked the pilot to calculate the maximum tailwind we could accept. He did, and then I asked him if he'd considered the downsloping runway there. His comment was, "Good catch." And I thought to myself, well, no, actually it wasn't just a good catch. It's actually something fairly fundamental that experienced pilots should think about every time they land at a short runway. Now, by the way, it's not always easy to find the slope of a runway. I sometimes find it on airport taxi diagrams. Other times I find it in the AFD, now called the chart supplement. And sometimes I just have to search for it on the internet. So back to the article, Downwind or Downhill goes into great detail about sloping runways. I particularly like one of the author's comments, which was, "But I will offer my own rule of thumb. Pay attention to any discomfort you might feel about the trade-off between a sloped runway and a significant tailwind. If you simply aren't comfortable making a decision, pitch your tent and wait. The slope will still be there in the morning, but the wind will eventually change to something with a bit less pucker." Now, here's a thought about both of these articles that I've just mentioned. As a pilot, we always have choices, but often we don't realize that. And the trick is to not get locked into a single plan of action. You have to think broadly about your options and then choose the most conservative option, even if that means delaying your takeoff or landing. And again, I'll have a link to that article in the show notes. And from the Jetwine blog, which is run by Rob Mark, Scott Spengler had an article called Pilots, OTC Drugs Can Be Interactively Bad. Now, OTC is over-the-counter, those drugs which you can buy without a prescription. Scott writes, before any pilot swallows an OTC drug new to them, they should read the FAA aviation safety page called Pilots and Medication. Here's the attention getter. Impairment from medication, particularly over-the-counter medication, has been cited in a number of accidents in general aviation. In a 2011 study from the FAA's CAMI toxicology lab, drugs and medication were found in 570 pilots, 42%, from the 1,353 total fatal pilots tested. Most of the pilots with positive drug results, 511 or 90%, were flying under Part 91. Scott notes that the FAA page includes a table that lists go and no-go medications and the rationale for the rating. The table also lists the medication or active ingredient that determines the medication's go or no-go rating, and the table lists the frequently used OTC medications, including antihistamines, nasal steroids, nasal decongestants, and cough remedies. Good article, and again, I have a link to it in the show notes. And one thing that's important about aviation is to always constantly be learning. And if you'd like to learn something new about the Garmin G1000, if you, for example, fly any aircraft that has the G1000 or the Cirrus Perspective, there are two great resources that can help you become an expert on those systems. The first is my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. It's 308 pages long and it has hundreds of photos illustrating the different screens you'll see. But best of all, it has a really detailed index in the back of the book that runs 6 pages long. So it's incredibly easy to just quickly find the page that you need to go to read the full details on that one little feature that is driving you nuts because you can't figure it out. Now, I know many people carry the book in the plane with them for just that reason, so they can look up on the fly those things they're having trouble figuring out. To order the book, just call 800-247-6553, which is the warehouse in Ohio where I stock my books, and they'll mail it right out to you. Or if you prefer learning through online courses, I have 3 online courses at my pilotlearning.com website. There's a G1000 for VFR course, a G1000 for IFR course, and if you want to know everything there is to know about flying instrument approaches using WAAS, which of course enables the new GPS approaches such as LPV and LNAV plus V, you'll want to take the Flying WAAS and GPS Approaches course. Now, you can buy the courses individually at the website, or if you sign up to support the show via Patreon at the $35 a month level or higher, you'll get continual access to all of these courses. Now, of course, you could also support the show at lower levels as well, either through Patreon or PayPal. For example, at the $4 a month level, you get access to the transcripts for each show, and at the $8 a month level, you get transcripts plus links to the many news stories that we have to cut out each show because we just don't have enough time to talk about them all. And of course, when you sign up to support the show, I'll read your name right here on the show. Now, it's easy to sign up to support the show. If you want to do it via Patreon, go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're all awesome listeners, or go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Now, at either site, you can make a monthly donation via credit card, or if you'd like to make a one-time contribution, you can do that via PayPal. Now, here are some of the folks who have joined us in the last 3 weeks. We have 3 new mega supporters, and they are Johnny McDade, who edited his pledge up to $50, Jim Goldfuss, who is also donating $50 a month, and Charlie Mason. I'll tell you a little bit more about each of them in a moment. We have several other new patrons, including Nabal Allenbar, Kent Mazia, Dmitry Kozovsky, Jarrett Davis, who edited his pledge up to $20, Jarrett Tarnoff, who signed up for the online courses at $35 a month. And we also have some new monthly supporters via PayPal, including Norman Jones, Roger Griggs. Now, he switched from Patreon to PayPal, and he increased his donation from $20 to $25 a month. Thank you, Roger. Sebastian Schoon and Christian Talbot Jones. We also had some one-time donations via PayPal, thanks to Vincent Salami, who donated $51. And he, by the way, just recently picked up a used Cirrus on the East Coast, and he said he learned some things from this podcast that may have saved his life. And I'll read from his email sometime on a future show. Jeff Seaborn, who donated $40 and says thanks for the podcast. Michael LaStella donated a one-time donation of $50, who found the recent IFR mock check ride very helpful. Now, as I mentioned, we have mega supporters who donate $50 or more a month, and I mention them each of our news show, and after 2 months, I send them one of my books. And those mega supporters are Brian Deere, who lives here in Northern California. You heard him last episode on our Flying to Mexico episode. Tyson Weiss, co-founder of ForeFlight. Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, who's been flying for nearly 50 years and flies an SR20 in Northern California. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation M2. He's now the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and TCB Composites, which make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. Seth Lake, he's a DPE giving check rides and specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his beach travel air, so check him out. He's down in Arkansas, and you can find his website at vsl.aero. Rick Miller instructs in the Cincinnati area, both out of Lunken Flight Training Center and with private students. He would love to teach full-time, but he still has that day job for a few more years. Justin Winter, he's been licensed for 3 years and flies a 2019 SR22T. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, proud owners and operators of 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. Johnny McDade, who's a singer, songwriter, musician, and record producer, and who I may be meeting up with later this week in Los Angeles when I'm down there. Jim Goldfuss, who's just returned from a long hiatus from flying, and he says he's working to get his CFI, II, and MEI because he would like to instruct full-time. He currently flies out of the Republic Airport on Long Island. And Charlie Mason, he flies out of Santa Monica, and after being out of flying for a really long time, he's getting back into it, getting checked out in a Cirrus SR20. So I want to thank all of our awesome supporters for this show. Now stick around because we're going to be talking about flying the Vision Jet as well as landing at Chicago O'Hare Airport. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let me tell you a little bit about my 75 hours of flying the Vision Jet over the past 5 weeks, including some of the challenges I found flying IFR out of some airports in Southern California. But first, let me play you what I had to say about what I like about this aircraft. This comes from episode 585 of the Airplane Geeks podcast.
Very good. And Max Trescott, do I understand correctly you're going to be taking up residency in Tennessee soon?
Yeah, it's true. I have a new home as well. It's in the front of a Vision Jet. Yeah, this has been the wildest couple of weeks in my entire flying career. I have usually done a handful of trips across the country each year. People who are looking to have some assistance, either moving a new or a used Cirrus across the country. But the last couple of weeks, literally in a 2.5 week period, I spent 40 hours in a Vision Jet or several different Vision Jets, which has been spectacular. I mean, I don't know that I've talked much about the plane here on the show, but Cirrus has always been my favorite aircraft, but the Vision Jet over the last year or two has become so much above and everything else my favorite airplane for a lot of reasons. One, I think the design is just really elegant. When you look at the outside, it's beautiful. When you look at the cockpit inside, it's not cluttered. It's just very simple and stylish and kind of feels like getting into a luxury European car. It's easy to climb into. I mean, literally it takes 2 seconds to plop yourself into the front seat. It's as easy as climbing into my office chair that I'm sitting in right now. And I contrast that with a number of other jets and turboprops where, it takes me 45 seconds to pretzel my body, into those seats. And you just know if there's an emergency, you'll never get out very quickly. And of course, the G3000 avionics are just fantastic. What a huge improvement over the G1000. To me, the appeal is the great design, the amazing avionics, and then you've got a great view out the front. It's got a huge window. It's got to be a bigger window than any jet. So it's just it's a fun airplane to be in. And I got type rated.
But how do you really feel?
Yeah,
Max?
right. Exactly.
Yeah, really. How do you really feel? You're really holding it back there.
So if anybody questions why it is the best selling light jet out there, well, I think they've really just knocked it out of the park from a design standpoint. So over the last year, I've been looking to, fly any opportunities I could and had just one client locally that I flew with occasionally. But I've picked up literally 4 different clients in the last 2 weeks that want me flying with them. They all need a lot of time. So I am in heaven, other than the fact that, some of these days are long and, I'm bringing a suitcase and I'm not home every night. which I guess is the price you pay when you're flying around in jets. By contrast, when I'm teaching locally, hey, never that far away from home, and I'm home every night. But I'm enjoying this incredibly hectic, busy time flying all the light jets. I'm not sure it'll last forever, but boy, is it fun.
I got to get myself out to the West Coast and look you up someday.
And by the way, you mentioned Knoxville. I was there 3 times in a week. So it was just
that's right.
back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it was just incredible. I mean, I love the people there. There are a lot of friends out there, and so that makes it kind of fun. But man, I sure was on the airlines a lot because it's got to fly the airlines to get there and then bring the airplanes home. And my thanks to my co-host who you heard in that clip. The first voice you heard was Max Flight, and the other voice was that of David Vanderhoff. Now, in a moment, I'll tell you about some of the minor challenges I've had flying into Chicago O'Hare and what I thought was actually a bigger challenge, which was figuring out how to fly an IFR clearance out of some of the airports in Southern California. Now, over the past month, by my count, I've landed in Chicago O'Hare, Knoxville, Tennessee, Decorah and Dubuque, both in Iowa, Paducah, Kentucky, Pueblo, Colorado, twice at Centennial Airport in Denver, twice in Cheyenne, Wyoming, once in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and Ogden, Idaho. I've also landed in Medford, Oregon, and Mammoth Yosemite Airport in California. And by the way, that was just after they cleared the runway after a major snowfall, so I've got some great pictures from that. I've also been in and out of a lot of airports in Southern California, including San Gabriel Valley, Brackett Field, Ontario, Van Nuys, Santa Monica, Torrance, Hawthorne, and Santa Barbara. Also, we had planned to go into the Cable Airport, but we at the last minute changed our mind. As we were arriving there, they said no straight ins. We had just been cleared for the visual, and we're indeed straight in. And then as we were overflying the field to join the pattern that they wanted us to fly, they told us they wouldn't have their jet fuel available until 3:30 in the afternoon. So at that point, I just said, two strikes, you're out. And we went and landed at Ontario instead, which was a much better choice. Huge runways, nice FBO. Now, in Northern California, we also have landed in San Jose International twice, Concord a number of times, Merced, and Castle. And of course, we've had a few interesting experiences along the way. For example, last week, we were just about to take off from Hawthorne at night, and we heard the airport ops vehicle call ground and ask if they could please talk to the Vision Jet. Well, both the aircraft owner and I were thinking, oh no, what did we do wrong? So we had a kind of sense of foreboding. But then the ops vehicle called us and asked if Max Trescott was in the Vision Jet. That was quite a surprise. So it turns out he is a listener to the podcast, and he recognized my voice when I was reading back our IFR clearance on the ground frequency. Now, unfortunately, he didn't mention his name. Otherwise, I would thank him personally. But I did want to thank him for saying hello and for his kind words about the show. And then the week before, I was in and out of Atlantic Aviation at San Jose International Airport just before the 49ers were about to start a playoff game at Levi's Stadium, which is just a few miles away. Now, Atlantic put out quite a spread of food for all the people who were flying in for the game, and I was enjoying some of their sandwiches, and I had reacted to somebody's comment who had said something, and I just made, some comment. And a moment later, someone else said, "Are you Max Trescott?" Well, yes, you guessed it. Another listener to the show. So I want to give a shout out to Bill Ferrelli. He's a student pilot learning to fly at the Orange County Airport in Southern California. And his CFI was flying a Citation to San Jose for a client, and he asked Bill if he'd like to come along for the trip, which, by the way, I think is a great thing. Anytime you're going somewhere and you've got an empty seat, invite a student pilot or someone else along to fly with you. Bill, as I recall, is also either a YouTube or a podcast creator. And a few minutes later, someone else in the FBO said, "Hey, you're the guy from Roseburg." And it turned out to be Steve, who I first met when I flew with a charter operator to Oregon, which I discussed in episode 126. Steve flies for a winery a few hundred miles away, and this is the third time I have run into him at various airports. And as Steve and I were talking, Paul Salich of Lone Mountain Aircraft stopped and said hello. He's based in Las Vegas, but he had just flown in San Jose for the 49ers game, and he was kind of dashing quickly through to get to the game. So it was kind of funny to see really how small our aviation world is and how connected it is. It's just been so much fun running into various people as I've been flying with the various owners in their Vision Jets around the country. Now, let me tell you about a few of the things that I learned flying into Chicago O'Hare. Now, this, by the way, would have been a a solo trip with just me in the airplane, but I wisely invited a pilot to come along for the trip. In fact, it was a client who I had to cancel, who I was scheduled to fly with, and I think he felt that was a pretty good consolation prize to get to be able to fly with me into Chicago O'Hare. Well, the first thing I did before I got there was I spent a lot of time at home reading through the airport layout diagram and studying it carefully. And I tried to figure out the runway or runways that I was most likely to land on, and of course, also to figure out the location of the FBO. Now, fortunately, in O'Hare, there is only one FBO, which is Signature, and it's located on the northeastern side of the airfield. So I correctly guessed that when we arrived, the aircraft would be landing to the west, and narrowed it down to two of the most likely runways I thought we might be landing on, 27 left and 27 right, both of which are north of the main terminal and kind of straddle the FBO. Well, we had a couple minor points of confusion on the trip, and we were able to sort through all of those. While we were still some distance from O'Hare, the Chicago Center controller asked if we could fly the RNAV. Now, both the other pilot and I kind of looked at each other quizzically because the question didn't fully make sense to us. We were fairly sure he was talking about one of the many arrival procedures that lead planes into O'Hare. However, almost all of them use RNAV, or area navigation, so we had no idea which arrival he was talking about. And the way he phrased the question, it made it sound like RNAV was the name of the arrival, and of course, we looked and there were no arrivals by that name. Now, had he asked instead, can you fly an RNAV arrival, we would have understood immediately what he was asking, and would have answered yes, because in the G3000 and the Vision Jet, it's one of the most capable glass cockpits, and it can fly just about any RNAV procedure out there. Now, I don't remember exactly how we answered the question, but I know it kind of reflected that we were a little confused, and the controller then told us to just go ahead and expect the Janesville arrival. To both of us, it sounded like he had said Gainesville, as in Gainesville, Florida. And as we looked through the list of arrivals going to Chicago, it quickly became clear that there was no Gainesville arrival. However, we soon noticed an arrival named Janesville and realized that that must be what he was talking about. And anyone who has flown frequently in the Chicago area would have instantly known what he was talking about, as Janesville is the name of a VOR in the area. Now, I do relatively little flying in the Chicago area, so I wasn't aware of that VOR or the arrival. But indeed, the Janesville arrival is not an RNAV arrival, so the controller must have concluded by our confusion over his question that either we were not RNAV capable or we just weren't very smart as pilots. Anyway, as we got closer to Chicago, the pace of the radio calls picked up, and I said to my co-pilot that we should maintain a sterile cockpit even though we were still a long way from the airport, as I didn't want to miss any radio calls. The Janesville arrival brought us into the Chicago area on essentially an easterly heading that took us north of the O'Hare Airport. And then we were given a series of radar vectors that essentially put us on a really long downwind to runway 27 right. The vectors took us past the airport and then further east out over Lake Michigan. We were then told to turn to the south, which essentially put us on a base leg, and then we were told to join the localizer. Well, earlier, we had been told to expect the visual approach to 27 right, so I had loaded the visual approach for 27 right into the Garmin G3000, and the G3000 has a capability to let you load a visual approach to most runways. Now, let me take a step back for non-instrument rated pilots and explain the visual approach. Typically, when flying IFR, you would expect to follow an instrument approach procedure that would send you along a safe pathway that usually lines you up for a straight-on approach to a particular runway. However, when the weather is good, to speed up the flow of operations, ATC will often assign a visual approach. And once you have the airport in sight, what this means is that you can then fly just about any pathway of your choice to get you to the runway. Most visual approaches don't have a chart, and often they're flown simply as long, straight-in approaches. Now, Garmin has developed a capability for loading a visual approach, which you can find in the G3000 and also in later versions of the G1000 and the GTN 650 and 750 panel navigators, and all of them essentially create a long magenta line that extends out along the extended center line of the runway for probably 30 or more miles. Pilots then simply intercept that line and follow it to the airport. And typically there are only 2 points on these Garmin visual approaches. One waypoint is called straight, and the other one is called final, and they're about 5 and 3 miles respectively from the end of the runway. I typically do a direct to command to take me directly to the waypoint called straight, and then the GPS turns the aircraft to join that magenta approach line to bring us visually to the runway. Also, and this is really great, the Garmin visual approaches provide vertical guidance. So you can couple the autopilot to follow these visual approaches down the glide path, just as you would with any instrument approach with a glide slope or a glide path. So ATC had told us to expect the visual to 27 right, but later they said to join the localizer, and when they did that, they were referring to the ILS approach to runway 27 right. Well, since we didn't have the ILS approach loaded, I simply intercepted the long straight line created by the visual approach that I had been told to expect by ATC and which I'd loaded in the G3000, and it essentially took us over the same path we would have followed if we'd had the ILS approach loaded. Well, all went well until we were approaching the shoreline, when ATC told us to maintain 4,000 feet until we reached Bonzo, and to maintain 170 knots until we reached Sibley. Now, apparently, both of these waypoints were part of the ILS approach, which we hadn't been told to expect, and which we hadn't loaded. Now, this is where it turned out to be extremely helpful to have a second pilot on board. Luke was able to quickly find the ILS approach on his iPad and see the waypoints that the controller had referenced in his instructions. And using the iPad, Luke was able to tell me when we had reached the first waypoint to which we were supposed to maintain 4,000 feet. And later he was able to tell me when we reached the waypoint at which we could slow to something less than 170 knots. Now, we could, of course, have loaded the ILS approach, but when I went to find it in the G3000 database, there were 3 versions of the ILS 27 right available, and I just didn't have the time to sort out whether they all included Bonzo and Sibley, and I certainly wasn't going to run the risk of losing the visual approach that I had already loaded and which was working fine for us. Now, looking at the approaches now, I went through all of them this afternoon. I can see that there's a chart for the ILS 27 right, a separate one for the ILS 27 right Cat 2 and Cat 3 approach, which have lower minimums, and then the third ILS 27 right Category 1 approach that requires special aircrew and aircraft authorization. And as I counted them up, I found, get this, 62 instrument approaches for O'Hare. So you can imagine it was a little confusing at the time to have to sort through all of them and then try to decide which of the 3 ILS 27 right approaches contain Bonzo and Sibley. Based on what I now know, in the future when flying into a large airport like O'Hare, even if I'm told to expect the visual approach, rather than load the visual approach available in some of the Garmin glass cockpits, I'll probably load the ILS for that runway instead, knowing that even though ATC said to expect the visual, they may still end up referencing some waypoints on the ILS. We did land uneventfully at O'Hare, though after touchdown, the controller was encouraging us to keep the speed up to get to the taxiway where he wanted us to exit the runway, as there was another aircraft landing behind us. Now, taxiing to the FBO signature turned out to be extremely easy, as the aircraft which had landed before us was going there, and we were simply told to follow the Gulf Stream, which fortunately seemed to know exactly where it was going. We shut down in a huge parking lot that was mostly empty, and it was some distance from the FBO, and so a van came out, picked us up, and it took me to the hotel. Now, I think I talked on a previous episode about departing out of O'Hare, where we must have talked on at least 7 frequencies on the ground while taxiing to runway 28 right to depart, so that was kind of interesting in itself. Now, what I found in my 75 hours of crisscrossing the U.S. in a Vision Jet over the past month is that it's a lot easier crossing the country than it is flying in and out of Southern California, because some of the departures out of SoCal have been fine, but at a couple of airports, the clearances they have are just amazing. Let's talk about the departure procedure out of Brackett Field. It is absolutely insane, and I've got to tell you, it looks like something was created in the 1950s. It starts with an ODP, which of course ODPs are not preloaded into your GPS. You can't load those departure procedures and fly them as you might to any other kind of departure procedure. Instead, you have to figure out a way to manually enter the data that you read in the ODP into your GPS, which becomes more challenging when told to do things like intercept radials to or from a VOR, because that means you're now going to have to use OBS mode if you want to use your GPS for your entire flight, which is my preference. And with all the modern tools we have today, I just don't understand why the FAA hasn't taken the time to create a departure procedure that can be loaded in a GPS and flown. It would greatly simplify getting out of Brackett Field and also San Gabriel Valley, which is nearby and had a similarly complex IFR departure. Now, here's the clearance we were given to fly from Brackett Field, which is KPOC, to Santa Barbara, KSBA, which is just 104 nautical miles away. And all this, of course, is to be flown in a jet that flies at 310 knots, so things go by quickly. The clearance I received was cleared to the Santa Barbara airport via the Brackett runway 26 departure procedure. Now, wait a second. What is that? That is the ODP, or obstacle departure procedure. And when you look it up, it tells you that the Brackett runway 26 departure is take off from runway 26 left or right, fly heading of 259 degrees until reaching 1,400 feet, which, by the way, is about 400 feet AGL. Then make a climbing left turn to a heading of 130 degrees to intercept the Pomona VOR 164 degree radial to the Prado intersection. Then continue a climb in the Prado holding pattern, hold south, right turns 344 degree inbound to cross Prado intersection at or above the MEA for the route of the flight. Now, when you look at this on a map, you take off to the west towards Santa Barbara, which is great. Then you turn southeast, which is the opposite direction, to intercept a radial to the south, and then climb in a holding pattern if necessary. And that's just the first few words of our departure, which was to fly the Brackett Field runway 26 departure. So here's the full clearance. Cleared to the Santa Barbara via the Brackett runway 26 departure, which I just described. And then Prado, Victor 16, PDZ, which is the Paradise VOR, Victor 197, POM, which is Pomona VOR, Victor 264, It's Me intersection, Victor 185, Dino, which I guess is named for D. Martin, that's kind of clever, Victor 27, Quang, direct, climb and maintain 4,000, expect 8,000, 10 minutes after departure, departure frequency 125.5, squawk 4761. And then, of course, you have to read all of that back correctly. So just to tell you what that looks like, we took off to the west, joined a VOR radial to the south, and then flew east to the Paradise VOR, and then northwest to the POM VOR, which is pretty much right next to the airport from which we departed, and then fly west towards Santa Barbara. Now, I flew with a different Vision Jet owner out of the San Gabriel airport, and their departure was pretty much the same thing. In fact, this owner had found a good workaround for having to intercept a VOR radial on the departure. He just found a waypoint that was close to the radial he was supposed to join, and he entered that waypoint into his flight plan, which I thought was a good solution for what's otherwise a ridiculously complicated departure. So all I can say is if there's anyone from the FAA who's listening who could update these ODPs, which read like they were created in the 1950s, to something that could be more easily programmed and flown with our modern GPSs, man, I'm sure all the pilots who fly out of these airports would be eternally grateful. Now, here's the irony of the entire thing. After given these just ridiculously complicated clearances, ATC gave us shortcuts that bypassed most of the complicated parts of the clearance. Though there was one complication that arose when we were given these shortcuts. Once or twice, we were told to join a particular airway that was part of our clearance, but we were told to join that airway at a portion that started before the segment that was included in our clearance. So again, simple to do if you're using VORs to fly the airway, but a bit of a scramble to figure out how to join portions of an airway that are not part of the original clearance. Well, all in all, flying the Vision Jet has been great fun, though it's brought me into a couple of these situations that have really tested my skills more than a typical day of teaching in the SR20 and SR22. And later this week, it looks like I'll be flying into Portland, Oregon, perhaps twice with two different owners who both said they'd like to fly there this week. And having flown into Portland before, I can tell you it is a lot simpler than flying out of Southern California. And coming up next, listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And this comes from one of our Patreon supporters, Mike from New York, via Facebook Messenger. He says, "Hi, Max. I wanted to drop you a note. I recently picked up my new-to-me Beech C-23 Sundowner. After listening to your podcast, you've spoken about those that meet their maker on the very day they buy their plane and how sad that is. I took your advice from about 4 episodes. I took a CFI friend with me. We took off at 2 p.m., and while we had a course, we had no real destination plan. We would simply fly until we needed to use the bathroom or became uncomfortable with darkness in an unfamiliar aircraft. We landed just at dusk, got a couple of rooms, a nice meal, and the next day we flew a gloriously smooth last leg home. Thanks to you, I learned from your ferry trips from east to west in planning. My only bad plan was starting on New Year's Day, as most things are closed, but the weather window was open, and we made it work in perfect VFR weather. Thanks for the entertainment and the guidance." Thanks for your note, Mike. And yes, there's nothing like flying when you have great weather. And this comes from David from Minnesota. He says, while taking one of our club's 2 Cessna 210s to Colorado a few months ago, the CO detector you recommended started going off, and he attached a photo with a reading of 89. That's pretty darn high. That's well above the OSHA standards. Note that the cabin heat is off, and now I know from you that half of carbon monoxide incidents don't involve the cabin heat. You can see that I'm full rich. Leaning it out dropped it to 3 parts per million, and opening all the vents dropped it further. Yes, I've found that myself. Definitely leaning the engine reduces the amount of CO coming into the cabin. This led to a fairly massive workup and fix by our awesome mechanic and maintenance director. Many things were done from getting the pilot door to seat flush to improving seals. One surprise was that the pop-in rubber seals that go into the many drain holes in the belly created a relative vacuum sucking CO into the cabin. Ultimately, they felt that much of the problem was due to design defects by Cessna when CO was less of a thing. We've been flying our 210s many hours over many years without any known CO issues. We now have a SensorCom inspector in each 210 for members' use. Thanks again for bringing recognition of the problem to GA pilots. You're very welcome, David. And I want to thank the several listeners who have emailed me in the past week. I will be getting back to you shortly about your interest in buying a new or used Cirrus. Now, if you happen to be one of those folks who's thinking, that might be kind of fun to try out, give me a call. I'm happy to give you a free consultation. We can talk about the ins and outs of buying new versus used. Just call me at 650-967-2500 or go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. And you can also use that to leave any listener questions or to give us any feedback. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, please take a moment. Yes, you know what I'm going to ask you. Please tell your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now, some of them won't know what a podcast is, so just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast apps for iOS and Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk, 3 words, and of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.